Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this webinar with Ascentis and eMemoir, who are providing support. This afternoon we're looking at funding and data issues around the delivery of non-regulated learning. The session is going to be led by Beej, Kaczmarczyk and Mike Atkinson. I'll allow them to do some introductions in just a second. We're looking to run this webinar for around about 50 minutes to an hour, and that's really determined by the volume and type of questions which come from yourselves, the attendees. Again, feel free to use a question or chat facility at any point to put questions to Beej and to Mike. And if we don't know the answers now, we'll be more than happy to continue a dialogue beyond there. If you're watching this on a video recording, and if you have any questions, you'll see that contact details will be available on the final slides. So without further ado, I'm going to mute my microphone and I'm going to hand over to Beej and to Mike. Thank you very much, all.
Thanks very much, Marek. Good afternoon, everyone. Myself and I'm Beej Kaczmarczyk and Mike Atkinson will be leading this afternoon's webinar. As Marek says, we welcome questions, comments as we go through, and I'll be moderating those, particularly when Mike is doing his bit of the presentation. This afternoon, we're looking at funding and data issues around the delivery of non-regulated learning. For those of you maybe listening in 10 minutes ago, this is very much coming from requests and issues raised with Ascentis centres about non-regulated learning, and particularly focusing on the funding and data issues. And hopefully those of you listening in are either the people that work in management information and data, or curriculum people, or both, because it's important that we do have both sets of people, particularly if you're managing curriculum and data, to understand these respective perspectives. Mike has got extensive experience in management information and data across the FE and training provider sector, and he obviously introduced himself in a few moments. I just want to ensure that we know what we're trying to cover in the next 50 to 55 minutes. So I'll be looking at what non-regulated learning is and why it's important, some of the eligibility principles applied to non-regulated learning, particularly in the area of adult education budget. We're going to focus very much on the adult education budget, but that's not to ignore the other places where non-regulated learning takes place. The importance of accreditation, particularly when that is offering some kind of quality assurance framework, and how RARPA works, and I'll be looking at that with you. Mike will then spend some time looking at how to record non-regulated programs in the ILR, as well as examples of the use of those class codes, and then I'll bring everything together to, if you want, to conclude on the importance of non-regulated learning, particularly where it is about promoting progression to, for example, level 1 to provision, to regulated qualifications as opposed to other non-regulated learning, to employment, to apprenticeships, and particularly the importance of non-regulated learning in the new context of devolution of adult education budget in those 45 to 50% of regions which now will be part of the devolved, will have devolved A/B from this coming August. So that's what the presentation's looking at. We hope we've got the right people listening in, so we know that a fair number of you simply, if you could please put your hands up, could you please tell us by just using the raised hand icon if you've got a management information or data background, so we get some sense of how effective our marketing has been. So thanks very much if you can do that. So I just want to start by giving you a wee bit of a reminder of what we mean by non-regulated. It's non-accredited, some people call it. But basically, this is all types of learning which doesn't lead to a regulated qualification. Sometimes this could be internally certificated. It can use different methods to record the outcomes of the learning. You see, that's quite important, particularly in quality assurance. So in what areas do we sort of see non-regulated learning occur? Wonderful for those show of hands, that's great, thank you. Well, we've seen it in independent living skills, particularly we're trying to engage those learners who maybe lack confidence, who maybe are the furthest away from learning or the furthest away from employment and the world of work. It can also be a strong aspect of locally commissioned and locally developed work, particularly around basic knowledge and skills, which can then allow, particularly adults, but not only adults, it could be young people as well, to then access technical and vocational qualifications. And this is very important when you're starting to look at the impact of devolution, particularly in the devolved mayoral authorities as well as Greater London. The big area that we've seen a lot of non-regulated learning is in employability and labour market re-entry, particularly in Job Centre Plus programmes, European Social Fund programmes, either mandated or non-mandated. And obviously that's also got a key aspect when it comes to designing shorter experiences without the pressure of a regulated qualification, where it's particularly helping people to get on the ladder to technical education, particularly where it's meeting local needs, which might be in the health and care sector, could be in retail or whatever. And of course, the area that we've seen a lot of non-regulated learning is in that wide range of community learning courses, often linking with those people who are lacking confidence, for whom maybe English is at a relatively low level, they might be new to, and English might be not their first language, or those people for whom there might be a need for some kind of experience which builds their confidence before they start looking at a qualification-bearing provision. So those are the areas that we see non-regulated learning, and clearly how we record it, how we make sure it meets the requirements of the funding agencies, audit, and of course also for quality assurance and inspection is something that we'll be looking at with you. So why is non-regulated learning important? And this is where I think we've got one of the dilemmas. Because if you go back 10 years, maybe even longer, 15 years ago, certificated programs where you're using an internal certificate or record of achievement were quite common. There was a period then when that number and that proportion of provision that was funded that was non-regulated actually was reduced, partly because of some of the needs to have more, the move from to a qualification and credit framework, and now, of course, the move to a national qualification framework, and the requirement for more external accreditation of what learners have achieved. However, it is still important for these reasons. Learners with low levels of basic skills will often need that first step before they start doing a regulated program, even if it's that at entry or level 1. We have obviously a lot of Job Centre Plus referrals that are looking for a shorter experience, which might not be long enough to provide the evidence for a regulated qualification. Learners with additional support needs, particularly those with education healthcare plans, who might need some kind of confidence building, some basic learning before they start to build the qualification programs. It can reflect local priorities and needs, particularly where you might have a disproportionate part of the population that's migrant-based, or made up of people who have come here recently to this country, or where there are reflective of quite different proportions of people with basic qualifications. And essentially, it is important because the people often furthest away from learning or employment need that first, if you want, experience of learning. We think it should be funded, we think it should be quality assured, and the important thing is to make sure that if you do quality assure it, and you have all of the things that we're going to look at today, robust audit trails, and a good system of RARPA and quality assurance, maybe using Ascentis as to provide a quality assurance framework, then you'll be in a much better position. So we know this demand for it, and if we start to look at the learners, and we're getting this data from the ILR data, we know that no two learners are the same. They might have similar backgrounds. One might be more confident than the other, and sometimes a non-regulated experience of learning, short, maybe 10, 12-hour experiences, maybe much better. We know that people have got different levels of English or a first language. Sometimes, you remember, some people that will be living in this country might not have written language in their first language, never mind in English. Respective levels of schooling and qualifications that people have got prior are also quite significant factors, as well as their experience of employment, how long they've been in the UK. They might also have health, social and welfare issues, and that therefore might relate your provision, particularly if it's community learning, to things like local health issues, welfare issues, addiction issues, etc., troubled families. The age and ability of the learners is also critical when being taken into account about what's the right offer to make to them. And that obviously includes learning difficulties, as well as those learners that might not know how to learn. They might be so new to learning, to maybe handling a pen or sitting in a classroom, that you need to have some kind of experience which gives them the confidence that recognises those early stages of learning, as well as the motivation to learn. Sometimes people are mandated to learn, it's a requirement. other times it's voluntary, and those different levels of motivation must be taken into account. So our basic point that we're making is that non-regulated learning is important for these many reasons, and therefore you as providers, particularly when you're responding to the priorities in your local area, should be aware of the demand for that type of provision. And since the AEB is about being demand-led, I think it's important to recognise that gap. However, if we do recognise how important non-regulated learning is, we've also got to make sure it satisfies the requirements of the funding agencies and audit. So these are the eligibility principles which you'll all be familiar with that affect the AEB, but there'll be similar principles applied across all the funding sources. So it must not be provision linked to visa requirements in this country. It mustn't be a statutory, for example, a license to practice. It mustn't be vendor specific, so an IT course specifically for one particular package. It mustn't be an induction to your institution, whether it be a college, a training provider, or whatever. And it mustn't also be a non-regulated version of a regulated qualification, unless, of course, that regulation qualification does not exist at the right level, for example, pre-entry or entry. The other thing you must note is it must not be above a notional level 2 in terms of the National Qualifications Framework, so at level 3 or 4 or any above. And if it is at notional level 2, the equivalent of GCSE level, then it must be one that's focusing on technical provision, particularly where this might be a new industry or a new need identifying that industry, and we haven't yet got the regulated frameworks in place. So I think those eligibility principles must always be applied to your own provision. So if you are in the process of planning, for example, AEB or other provision next year, make sure if it's non-regulated that you satisfy these basic principles, and they will underpin what Mike will be doing with you in a few moments when we're looking at how to record it and how to obviously make the appropriate entries on the individualized learner record. So I think that gives you the sort of the main principles. I just want to separate out two areas where there is, for example, quite a lot of non-regulated learning, particularly with adults. One is English and maths, and you can see there that in the latest guidance, the ESFA will fully fund non-regulated English and maths learning for learners, including pre-entry for those aged 19 and over, particularly where you've got those learners with significant learning difficulties or disabilities, where, again, the assessment, and this is one of the key things, a key part of the RARPA process is that the initial and diagnostic assessment must show that a regulated qualification, for example, a GCSE, a functional skill in English and maths, or a stepping stone qualification in English and maths might not be the most appropriate. And this is quite important, particularly at pre-entry level. So bear that in mind with non-regulated in English and maths. The other area I just wanted to highlight is, and I know some of you are providers of traineeships for adults, is that, again, if you've got an adult maybe coming to you through European Social Fund or through Job Centre Plus, who's on a shorter program, a traineeship, where the bulk of the program is the work placement, and there is a bit of work preparation training. Well, that work preparation training can again be non-regulated. You can have regulated qualifications inside the traineeship, for example, a functional skill in English maths, or you might have a short level 1 award or certificate. But you can also have the work preparation training, you know, finding the job, preparing for the job, etc., which, to avoid putting extra pressure on the learner, is funded through the £970 that you get for the combined work placement and the work preparation training. So just be aware of that. These are quite significant areas that need to be looked at separately because they're quite different types of learners. So what is the importance of quality assurance? Before we start looking at the way in which you audit and record, I think it's important that you do have to have in place appropriate and robust quality assurance processes. And the ones that obviously are recommended, particularly by the funding agencies, is RARPA, whether this be Scotland or England or Wales. There's a common model, and it's got a critical role to play, particularly where it's about locally designed provision. When you start looking at the impact of devolution, which obviously is affecting many of you listening in, across the 6 authorities that will have devolved arrangements as well as Greater London. And that is contained in the Learning and Work Institute's report of 2017, why they thought that would be, for that locally commissioned provision that wasn't leading to a regulated qualification, it is important to have RARPA in place. So what I'm saying is, you've got to meet the eligibility principles that I already covered with you. Secondly, you must have a really good quality and robust quality assurance in place, and RARPA does provide this. And you can see here the new model, which is the updated model with the 6 steps, starting with identifying the needs, accurate initial and diagnostic assessment, challenging objectives, feedback to the learners, an appropriate assessment at the end, recorded with evidence, and you might only use your own institution certification, or you might use an accreditation framework, but the learner progress is being monitored, and in particular, that should lead to more learning, maybe volunteering, maybe employment, maybe an apprenticeship. My apologies for the spelling of progression. That's not mine. This is actually taken from the Learning and Work Institute's own slide, which obviously missed the R there. One thing to note, though, and this is the key point, that we're trying to avoid some of the confusion and the hesitancy around non-regulated provision, is that for non-regulated provision using the RARPA process, the management information is just as critical. It should be as rigorous as the collection of data from regulated qualifications. And because we need to know what people have completed, we need to know what outcomes they've got, and we need to know how many of them have then progressed to regulated qualifications. So that could be done through sample post-course reviews, the way in which you collect the data at the very end, the way you record that on the ILR, because local commissioners will expect to see, for example, if you're bidding for non-regulated learning in ESOL in one of the combined authorities, part of your bid will have to say how you're going to record outcomes and how you're going to ensure maximum progression to regulated qualifications. Maybe, for example, stepping stone qualifications in English or whatever. So, I really want to stress the importance of that quality assurance. So, meeting the funding eligibility principles, and obviously a clear quality assurance process. Now, since we're focusing predominantly today on the AEB, we know that the adult education budget is made up of those bits in England. You can see non-regulated provision occurring in the adult skills bit. You can also see it in the community learning. And obviously community learning is a separate subject that we've looked at in the past. What is critical is that when you look at the AEB, it's funding, and I think we need to say that, besides qualifications, its purpose is to engage adults. So non-regulated learning to engage adults. So it's offering them learning activities. Look at the third point. It's broader than qualifications, preparation for life, adult re-engagement, and the very things we talked about before. And you've got the freedom and flexibility to include a range of activities in your actual provision, as long as it meets those criteria that we described, which may or may not include qualifications. And since supporting people to learn English is a priority, it obviously does raise the issue of non-regulated English and ESOL programs. So I think that is giving you, if you want, the key message there. But also, it's suggesting that besides the non-regulated learning should be used as the entry point for people to either activate their first level 2 entitlement, hopefully then their first level 3 entitlement, targeting those people who are unemployed, or of course, increasingly, and this year we've got it, for those people who will be funded this year and next year will be funded this year for a trial period, who are low paid, as well as those who are unemployed. So we know that we're trying to get as many adults who haven't used up their entitlements to get those entitlements, including English and maths regulated qualifications. And here you can start to see, and this table doesn't vary too much, learning to progress to level 2, fully funded up to and including level 1 for the 19 to 23-year-olds and for 24 plus unemployed, but it's particularly part of the local flexibility. Now, it's the local flexibility that I think is provided with many of us with the opportunity to grow and maybe to reintroduce non-regulated learning, I say once we've met all those other key conditions. So it can be bespoke, locally designed learning, which can include non-regulated learning to support progression, to upskill people, as well as obviously making sure that you will use the regulated quals or units of quals, which are available for the flexible offer. And we can see that that flexible offer does include those non-regulated learning opportunities. So there are two major opportunities here for, I think, more non-regulated learning. One is the devolution of AEB, and the second is the local flexibilities that apply to all of us, even those of us operating out with the locally devolved authorities. So what method and how do we recognise the size of those programmes and the funding attached to them? Well, this is done through the single activity matrix. You all are familiar with it. It enables colleges and other learning and other training organisations to calculate and claim funding for qualifications and other learning activity that's not qualification based. And I think that's the important message to get over. Look at the different types of learners for whom non-regulated learning is critical. Look at the locally devolved plans that are coming through. Look at the local flexibilities. Meet the eligibility principles. Have RARPA in place. And I think you've got a very good, well thought through offer, particularly for, if not this year, for next year. But this means that we've got to be able to record and record non-regulated learning in an appropriate way. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mike. Mike, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Beej, for a very comprehensive introduction and description of RARPA and non-regulated provision. I agree with Beej in everything he said. There is a place for non-regulated provision, particularly when it comes to learners coming back into education or wanting to retrain, or low-level learners or low levels of prior attainment. So it is an area that we can look at and make some progress on. What I want to look at is about how we record that information in the ILR. And to do that, it would normally be the management information team within the college or the training provider that would do that. And because they are not regulated qualifications, there is no specific qualification associated with non-regulated provision, then the qualification aims that have to be used are what we call class codes or generic learning aims. Now, in order to record RARPA provision or non-regulated provision inside the ILR, it has to follow exactly the same rules as a normal, a regulated qualification. There's no such thing as a normal qualification. But as a regulated qualification, we need a learning aim, we need all the data that's associated with that learning aim, and all the relevant information in the ILR that whatever you would use for a regulated aim, you would use for a generic aim or a class code aim. Now, the ESFA on the slide you can see have published a document which describes the use of learning aim class codes or generic learning aims. This used to be something called Annex H of the ILR specification, but they've now released it as a separate document in its own right. The important thing, though, which comes on the left-hand side of the slide is in beige, is the provider support manual. You should only use generic learning aim codes if there is no regulated qualification learning aim available to the learner. Now, that means that your IAG and your initial assessment processes must be very robust in order to meet that guideline. And you must be able to demonstrate that the generic learning aim or the non-regulated learning is the most beneficial for that learner at that time. Excuse me. If we could move on. Have I got control of the slides, Beej? Thank you. If you look into this document, then you will find a grid or a matrix, if you want, of all the class code categories. And the two that are particularly interesting to us today are category A, B, F, and G. Now, although I've quoted 4 there, they're actually in 2 groups. The top ones, A and B, are non-regulated learning aims for adult skills provision. That is formula-funded provision, where the funding is generated from within the ILR, and the funding on the Learning Aims Reference Service, the LARS, is quoted inside the matrix values. So if you are offering a non-regulated or non-regulated provision to a learner that is not ESOL, English or Maths, then your learning aim must come from category A. If you are offering English and Maths but unregulated learning aim with formula funding, then you would use category B. If you are in the community where it's non-formula funded learning, then you would use categories F and G. And that's important that you get the right learning aim, because that's what will be tested in any audit process. So we've got categories A and B, F and G for regulated, for non-regulated aims, formula funded and non-formula funded.
Mike, we've got a question here from one provider. He said we've got both. Is that okay?
Yeah,
We've got both formula funded and community learning funded.
Yeah. For the appropriate episode of learning, you would use the appropriate code. So for the episode of learning that you want to formula fund, or use the normal formula funded methodology, and I'm assuming that it's non-English and Maths. If it is, you would use category B. If it isn't, you would use category A. And again, for the formula funded learning, the community learning, you would use the categories F or G. And very shortly I'll show you how to identify the appropriate learning aims in the LARS, which I think, and to be fair, that is sometimes the most difficult thing. From an MIS perspective, what goes on in the classroom goes on in the classroom. We just need to make sure that we record the activity appropriately so that it is robust for audit and for any other funding purpose. And one of the most difficult things is identifying the correct aim. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll understand how to find the right aim for non-regulated learning activities.
That's great. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. So, as I've said, from an ILR perspective, we treat it exactly the same thing. There's no difference between a non-regulated aim and a regulated aim. The difference is, as we've said, is the learning aim code. Now, the way you identify the learning aim code for a regulated aim is that you would know the qualification title, you would know the awarding body, you would know the level, you would do a search on the LARS, you'd find the learning aim, and you would attach that learning aim into it. And it will say, bricklaying with whichever awarding body. However, for non-regulated learning, it doesn't do that. It simply says that it is non-regulated formula funding, and it gives you other information which I'll go through in a moment. So what we have to know before we can choose the learning aim code from the LARS is we must know what level the provision is going to be delivered at. We need to know its program weighting, and we need a matrix, and it will have a matrix listed funding value. We also need to know the sector subject area at Tier 2, because that's where the learning aim sits. Now, if I remember right, there are 66 Tier 2 sector subject areas. So you've got to know exactly which one it is. And then, like any other learning aim, it must have a completion and an outcome status. So initially it would be continuing with no outcome, and then when they achieve or when they complete and achieve, and you inform the MIS, they would record it as completed, achieved, or withdrawn, or completed, no achievement. Whenever you complete a learner, then you must have a destination. And Beej mentioned earlier the fact that the destination information is very important. And it is, because this is provision that we can't identify the benefit of unless we can see the progression. And that progression is moving towards further learning within the regulated qualification arena or into employment.
Mike, there's a question here from someone saying, in your experience, because you've worked across a lot of different providers, do you think there's any advantage with non-regulated learning having some kind of accreditation framework around it, say from an awarding body, that gives almost like a stamp of quality in your own experience?
I've not really come across anybody who's ever said that, and I've worked with a lot of auditors and a lot of training providers, and nobody has ever mentioned that. I don't think there's any. Personally, I don't think there's any real benefit. What is really important is that we follow the RARPA framework that you described earlier in the presentation, and that we can evidence that flow and that progression of the learner through that chain of events, if you want. The fact that it's accredited by an awarding body is a good thing. It won't do any harm, but I don't see there's any particular an absolute need to do so. Quite often you do pick up units from awarding body qualifications or parts of awarding body qualifications and use them as non-regulated learning. But if as it said earlier on, if there is a regulated learning aim, qualification or unit, then you should always use that where possible.
So it could be a more of a mix and match program, couldn't it?
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
How the question that I often find is, how do I work out the level, Mike?
That is a good question, and I there is no scientific formula that I am aware of that can do that. I think that's a curriculum issue. When they're delivering it, they will set learning aims and objectives, and they will know the level and the depth that they are going to. Yeah. I would normally expect, unless it is a very specific training program with an employer which is specific to a particular discipline, I would normally expect to see it at entry level and pre-entry level. Yeah. Otherwise, it would be a qualification, a regulated qualification.
We might be able to use some kind of national standards, for example, in English and maths and IT, that might give us a measure. Yeah. Great. Thanks very much, then, Mike. Thank you for that.
Okay, so in order to identify the correct learning aim, then, we know that all learning aims are stored in the LARs, but without the appropriate information, you will find them a nightmare to find. At one time, I would think about 3 years ago, or up until about 3 years ago, your class codes were generated internally, and they give you a formula to do that, and a methodology by which you could generate your own or use your own learning aim class code, generic code. However, they changed that I think it's about 3 or 4 years ago, and they listed all the qualifications, or all the learning aims, I should say, inside the LARs, but didn't tell you how to find them. And I can remember a lot of MIS people having a lot of problems trying to identify the correct learning aim for non-regulated learning aims. However, there is a simple process to do that, which possibly people didn't know at the beginning, but hopefully they will know by now, and if not, you certainly will by the end of this presentation. And the important information that you need to find the correct learning aim is you need to know exactly what's going to be delivered. Is it going to be vocational? Is it going to be English? Is it maths? Is it ESOL? Because we know that we have separate qualification categories, learning aim categories, for vocational and for English, maths and ESOL. And you also need to know the funding model for which it's going to be delivered, and that is whether it's community or formula funded. Beej has just mentioned level, but we need the level. Excuse me. We need the level of qualification.
I can add something there, actually, Mike. I think that this is where your awarding organisation would be really helpful, because they could help you determine the level, since that's what they're very experienced at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A good point, Beej. Very good point. Moving on, so we need the level. We also need to know how many hours that you will need to deliver that particular element or episode of learning. We need the sector subject area at tier 2, and we need the program weighting. Now, the program weighting, generally, there is a list on the internet that, or a list on the internet that identifies your sector subject areas at tier 2 and also tells you the appropriate program weighting for that sector subject area. So it's not something you would generally make up. It's something that you would have to look up and find. And there's plenty of stuff on the internet for sector subject areas. And in fact, it probably is still inside the LARs. Though I have to say, I don't know exactly whereabouts in the LARs it would be.
Mike, I'll just go back a minute, just because I did jump over this one. Can you see the table, the single activity matrix in front of you, Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for one person, they just wanted us to go back to it. Is that what you mean by the weightings? Because
it is the program weighting factor. Yeah, it's called program weighting. I still use the old term, which is program weighting factor. Yeah. There used to be about 5 or 7 of them. That's now down to 5. But that's what you would need to know. Now, every subject sector area at tier 2 has been assigned a program weighting. And you would need to refer to that in the various lists and documentation that's available from the ESA, both online and in the documents that are available also online. And so if you just put a search in for sector subject area tier 2 program weightings, there's some really good documents up there that are very, very clear on what to use.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. So how do you identify the correct learning aim for non-regulated provision?
Yeah. So the first thing you would need to do, it's always better to narrow the search as much as you can. And in this example, I'm going to search for an adult skills at level 1. And so you can see highlighted in the slide, which is the search page of the LARs, I've ticked the adult skills and I've ticked level 1. That's going to reduce the list of learning aims quite significantly because there are literally hundreds of these learning aims on the LARs. Once you've got those 2, at the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, you'll see another highlighted area, and that says additional filters. In order to find the most appropriate learning aim at non-regulated learning aim, you should use these additional filters. And if you touch the plus box to the left of the word additional, it opens up a big category, which is on the next slide. Or list of categories, I should say. So and here we are. If we go back one slide, Beej. So once you open that additional filters button, the screen changes and it brings in a lot of other categories for you to look at. And there's a lot of useful information in there outside of the non-regulated stuff, like qualification types, the level 3 categories, local flexibilities, level 2, and things like that, that you can be very selective with your learning aims. For example, I'm just looking at there, if you wanted an A level and only an A level, then you just highlight the A level and do search and it'll only bring back A levels. But for the purpose of this discussion, what we want is, we know that we want a category A because it's formula funded. And so if you look at the bottom left-hand corner where it says category in the highlighted area, you can just see the grey shading where I've highlighted category A. So that will only bring me learning aims that are relevant to category A. And then on the subject sector area tier 2, where Beej is pointing now, you'll see the blue line where I've asked for building and construction. So I'm looking for level 1 learning aim, for a learning aim at level 1, category A, formula funded. It's non-ESOL maths and English provision, so it's vocational provision, and I want it in the building and construction area. I now press the button search, and it will bring back the list of qualifications that's on the next slide.
And this in effect is when you're talking about tier 2, it's much more detailed information around building and construction.
That's right. That's right. And if you look at this particular slide, there are 5 highlighted areas. The top one on the left-hand side is just indicating that we've highlighted adult skills. If we didn't want adult skills, we would highlight one of the other areas for the community. We've highlighted level 1, so that we know we get in level 1. And an important thing to do now is to look down the title. Now, it's probably very difficult for you to read this. It's difficult for me as well, even with the screen. I'm just going to expand my screen. That's it. And I can see that that's a non-regulated SFA formula-funded provision at level 1 in building and construction, and it's 21 to 44 hours, and the program weighting is band C.
And so that band C is determined by the sector subject area tier 2.
Absolutely.
Most construction is C, but you could find some construction that might be weighted at D if it was construction engineering, for example.
Yes, you could. And different ones, different sector subject area tier 2, different ratings. Generally, you will need to know what subject sector weighting you are working with. But I would say the majority of cases, there's only one. The other important thing to look at is on the right-hand side where it says LDNS. And the LDNS stands for last date for new starts. If there's no date in there, that means that it's still an eligible learning aim. But if there is a date against that, as there is against the one above, like from, then that is the last date that a learner can be enrolled onto that learning aim. So always check your last date for new start to make sure that the learning aim is still eligible. And then once you've agreed that that's the correct learning aim, the learning aim reference code is on your left hand side in the red pink, which is the ZOO. I'm afraid I can't read it, but that is your learning aim. And that way you've got the correct learning aim for the learning that's going to be delivered by the curriculum, and you can record that information alongside all the other regulated learning aims inside the ILR.
Okay, Mike, so we can actually go back, because we know it's program weighted C, 21 to 44 hours.
Yep.
That's the learning aim code that we're going to use in the ILR to record that non-regulated learning. So let's go back let's go back. Let me just try and get back. 21 to 44 hours. It's in that band there, and it was weighted at C. So we can then calculate the funding value if
Correct.
that adult is enrolled, is retained, and completes the program. In other words, completes the non-regulated program. You've got evidence of that through RARPA. What you earn as funding is £195.
Absolutely correct, yep.
So you can see how the funding level comes out of this. Now, I think a couple of things have arisen while you were just describing that. One or two people still don't know why there might be a difference between, for example, B and G. If they're doing non-regulated English and maths and it's funded through the formula, why is it different from funded through community learning? And I think the answer there is, Mike, is that if you're a provider, and for example, you're a community learning provider, you will often have a contract which is based on your total expenditure or past level of activity for community learning, which includes a whole lot of different types of learning, often non-regulated learning, often not leading to qualifications. You might then also have a separate contract which is formula funded to deliver, for example, English and maths, which could be, besides non-regulated English and maths, could also include GCSE English and maths and functional skills. Absolutely. Now, if you're a community learning provider, these are two different funding sources. One is 35 and the other is 10. Yep. So I think it's important to understand that these are two separate sources of funding from ESFA.
And the other important thing to remember is that on categories A and B, it is formula funded provision, which means the funding is calculated within the ILR and uses the matrix, the single matrix. Whereas for the non-formula funded, it is community provision, which is claimed by the provider at the end of the year. And so the value of the provision that's being delivered is somewhat, or to some extent, calculated by the provider and not by a formula-driven methodology.
It won't be a formula. It's often based on your gross expenditure in that area. So as long as you spend all of it in the community learning fund, or whatever your allocation was, it tends to be repeated. And obviously you can move between the two funds. That's been done. One other question is about why we don't mention pre-entry. Well, in all the things that we've talked about, entry does include pre-entry, doesn't it, Mike?
Absolutely, yeah. The entry qualifications, I would always classify entry and pre-entry at the, within the term of entry. And quite often, as long as you can demonstrate that it is the best provision for that learner and that you are not duplicating prior learning, if that learner needs pre-entry level qualifications, then that's fine. That's fine. So it would be entry level, yeah.
And one of the questions that relates here to the formula funding, what happens if a learner withdraws partway without completing the non-learning activity? The methodology that applies here is still 80% on program, 20% on achievement, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. So there's 80% of the on-program funding available for the duration of that course, and it's paid by a monthly basis based on the learner's presence or being active on the last day of the calendar month. And if the learner let's say that the provision lasts for 3 months, if the learner leaves in the middle of the second month, you will only get one on-program payment. If they leave at the end of the second month, you will get 2 on-program payments. But bear in mind that the first program payment in the funding methodology that we currently have, it's a double payment. So three calendar periods would be four. Would be 4 payments. So you would get the first 2 in the first month, and then every subsequent month, as long as the learner is still recorded as in learning, in other words, they haven't got an actual end date, you will get 1 month's funding. And if the learner leaves early, then you will lose all the funding up until the date, after the date after which they left.
Yes, and obviously if you don't have evidence that they've achieved the non-regulated learning aim through RARPA or any other means, then you lose also the 20% achievement element.
Correct. You would have to put the learner down as, if you have no evidence of completion and achievement based on the goals that you set at the beginning of the program, then you would have to record no achievement. You would lose your 20%. Just another point on the learners who leave programs early, and this is irrelevant of irrespective, I should say, in terms of whether it's regulated or non-regulated provision. You must have evidence of learning activity up until and including the last date of attendance that you record as their end date. You must have that information. Otherwise, the auditor will look for the most appropriate date, i.e. the last date you can evidence that learning took place, and use that date, which could mean you could lose more funding.
That's great. Thanks very much. So can you just sum up some of the audit requirements for us, Mike?
Yeah, of course. It's, again, like every other learning aim. Somebody once described learning audit to me as, did they come, did they stay, did they pass, and can you prove it? And essentially those rules still apply. The difference is that we need to make sure that the learner is eligible. Now, that learner should follow your eligibility criteria for non-regulated learning aims exactly the same as the regulated learning aims. So we need to know that the learner is eligible. Now, by eligibility, we generally mean residency in the UK. In England, I beg your pardon, or the EU.
Yeah.
The other thing that's important is that you would need to be able to demonstrate attendance and achievement. So you would need to show that the learner has attended the program, that there is evidence of achievement in line with their learning plan, with their learner file. So the learner file becomes extremely important. and they would want evidence to show that it's the most appropriate learning, that the learning has taken place, and that there are ample opportunities for that learning to take place. And again, that's just as important, because if you say that course is going to be, or that program is going to last, say, 40 hours, and each session is 2 hours, then the auditor will want to see 20 sessions available for that learner to attend. The fact that they didn't attend all of them isn't necessarily a problem, but what is a problem is if your register ends and there's only 36 learning opportunities. So it's very important that your register aligns with your start and end dates, and that there are the hours available, or the hours are available to complete the program based on the amount of hours inside the learning aim. And of course, the other important thing in the learner file is in the RARPA process is to make sure that the learning is the most appropriate learning activity for that learner, that there is no duplication of prior learning, and that we are not trying to fund something that isn't technically funded.
So that raises two issues and two questions, Mike. Thanks very much. First question is, and certainly I can look at this one, is there any limit or cap on the maximum amount of non-regulated provision that a learner can do? And the answer is no. It depends on the learner. Remember, no two learners are the same. So you might find that some learners with learning difficulties and disabilities, initially most of the program might be non-regulated provision. However, I think what Mike is saying is you must make sure that if that learner is capable of doing a regulated qualification, you shouldn't replace it with a non-regulated element, because they should be stretched and challenged to the highest possible level. So you could have a learner that, all right, the majority of the program is non-regulated. For example, adults with learning difficulties, disabilities, the long-term unemployed coming to you through Job Centre Plus. But if that learner is able to do a regulated element, whether it be a full qualification or a unit of a qualification, that you should ensure that they do. So that hybrid model should appear. But there's no actual cap, is there, Mike?
No. It's all about duplication.
Yeah,
and prior learning. Yeah,
exactly. And is it, in your experience, have you ever seen anyone create non-regulated learning that doesn't look like an exact duplicate for regulated, but has one or two common aspects, but does things that the regulated qualification doesn't do?
I've not come across anything specific like that, but I have come across providers who have tried to fund non-fundable provision through the back door using non-regulated learning aims, and even going to the point of registering that qualification or registering the learner with the awarding body, which is a definite no-no. You know, there was some specific examples, certainly a few years ago, where people were doing things like first aid and stuff like that via the back door, and that shouldn't happen.
I mean, it is possible in response to that, if you've got a regulated qualification that only exists at, say, level 1 and 2, and you've got learners coming in at entry level, then obviously, yes, you can. You know, because it isn't the right level. And if you've got the initial assessment of the learner that shows that the level 1 is not attainable, then it makes sense to have something on at entry level. That could be non-regulated. But once they've completed the entry and they are capable of going on to the level 1, then you must use the regulated qualification.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would concur with that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I'll also go back to the principle we said before, is that since that you want to assure yourselves as well as the user, and don't forget the person that might use the non-regulated learning certificate or evidence of learning might be someone else. It might be a different provider, it might be an employer. I think there are some benefits in having that quality assurance or independent quality assurance that an awarding organisation might provide. It's not necessarily essential, but I would see it as desirable.
Yeah, that would always augment it. And the other thing that, or the other 2 points that I want to make, if I may, one is a reiteration, and that's about destination information. Destination information is very, very important. And the other thing that we need to mention is you need to refer to, if you are working with devolved authorities in the devolved areas, then you need to refer to the documentation provided by the devolved area as to what their rules and regulations are about non-regulated provision. The likelihood is they will be the same as the ESFA's regulations, but you just need to double check.
That's very important, Mike. And obviously, another question that's arisen, we've got loads of questions, so we've really got to thank everyone for engaging, is that say you're running a non-regulated, I mean, remember, adult education budget is a continuous flow of activity. It's not all about what happens in September, October. And if you find that within your allocation, within the grant that you've been given or within your contract, that you find that the learners have completed some non-regulated learning and they're not ready to progress, but they want to do maybe something different, or you've got some different learning outcomes, you can run that again as non-regulated as learning, as long as it's not a duplicate of what they've already done. So it might be it's expanding their knowledge, or it could be a different set of skills. It might even be that you move from pre-entry to entry.
Yep. I don't see anything wrong with that. Again, it's down to what the learner journey is all about. Where is their aim? Where are they aiming to get to? And in some cases, for non-regulated learning and the learners who participate in that type of learning, simply getting them into learning is a major feat.
Absolutely.
And giving them additional learning, building up their confidence, building up their knowledge base, is getting them and preparing them for regulated qualifications, and hopefully, if they're not in work, back onto the journey towards work.
Absolutely, Mike. Thanks for that, then. Thanks for that. So we've mentioned devolution several times, and we know that that's happening in the next year in the 6 authorities, the mayoral combined authorities, which include, I think, is it Tees Valley, what do you call it, Merseyside, Greater
Manchester,
Birmingham. I think I think it's also Peterborough,
Cambridge, and the West of England.
And
obviously the GLA.
The Greater London Authority. So these authorities from this year will be responsible for the adult education budget in terms of policy and provision, and they're obviously trying to make sure they get the right mix of provision. And guess what? That right mix of provision can include non-regulated provision. And that's partly because they see this as very much responding to those local needs. Mike identified, for example, the people furthest away from employment or apprenticeships. You'll see this contained within the local skills strategies, which are now underpinning the procurement process. And I know that we are certainly interested in, myself, we're involved with the Greater Manchester one, as well as the potential Sheffield City region, which will be delayed, won't occur till 2020-21. But you can see that the themes can be around adult employability, independence, basic skills. There's a big emphasis on English, maths, and language and digital skills. Here's an example. This is from the Liverpool City region. And you can see the type of things that they're looking for, adult employability skills, capacity building measures, a lifelong skilled, more flexible provision that improves progression, driving up progression outcomes for English and maths. So people might need to do locally community-based ESOL, English and maths, targeting those people furthest away. So you can see that, again, within any one of those combined authorities, there will be different demands, and non-regulated provision can be some part of the offer that you make. But the key thing here is it's about learning and progression, And I think that's the thing that we've emphasized throughout. So I can see the move away from a centralized system to much more locally developed and devised needs as a good thing for us in adult education, community learning, non-traditional learning. It could re-energize a lot of the things that we're doing because of the greater freedoms and flexibilities. I think this gives you more opportunities for non-regulated learning, but subject to what we've covered to here. So I think that has got some very important benefits here. And that focus on outcomes rather than just progressions, I think, is also important. So this relaxing some of the roles might actually allow a wider choice of learning provision, including non-regulated learning. You may be better targeting it to meet the needs of those local communities. So linking this up with things like the employability agenda, public health, working with troubled families, working with those people with maybe mental health issues as well as with addictions, could all be aspects of this. So I think there's a great opportunity now to use and to see a growth of non-regulated learning in devolved authorities. And that's what you said as well, Mike. I think there's some opportunities. However, what we've said throughout is make sure you're fitting with the eligibility principles, with the principles of good audit, and with RARPA. And that's why any work with an awarding body that helps you to do that, for example, in determining levels, etc., and how to progress into regulated qualifications, is important. Thanks very much then, Mike, for that. I think we've got some notice from Ascentis of some future events that might actually pick up on some of these. So again, if you're a centre, that we've got webinars looking at pre-entry level awards in ESOL on the 5th of March and the 6th of March. And I'll be attending the regional introductory ESOL conferences or events that we've got in Birmingham on the 20th of March and London on the 27th of March. If you want more information on that, please contact my colleague Graham Harwood at Ascentis. He'll obviously be happy to give you more information about those. And obviously, if you want to pick up anything that we covered today, including what Mike covered, then obviously get in touch with us. We're happy to deal with your questions and comments. Have we got any more questions or that we've not covered? I've been monitoring all the questions. We've had loads of them, and hopefully by directly or indirectly, we've covered them all.
Yeah, good. Like you say, good opportunity just to ask now. Have we missed any of those questions? I think we covered everything, but if there is anything that we missed, please let us know. We might have to take it offline, but we will be more than happy to do so, won't we?
Mike, is there anything else you want to add?
He might just have unmuted himself there.
All right.
Let's just see. No problem. So yeah, any final questions? Because what we'll do is we'll just check if Mike's still around there, if he has anything to add, any final points. And then what we'll do is we'll stop the recording. You'll all be receiving a copy of the video recording along with the slides. Yeah. So please get in touch with us if you have any further questions.
Just before we finish the recording, Mike, well, thanks very much to Mike for his contributions. Yeah, thanks very much to all of the people that have asked questions, and hopefully we've answered them all. And thanks very much to Ascentis for helping to organise and promote today's webinar. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Marek. So we'll close the recording now. And if there are any